Hello. Now let's understand what exactly does it mean by control template in WPF. So every control in WPF, let's take one example of a button control. Every control in WPF is by default going to be divided into two parts. So there will be something which is called as appearance or visual of the element, and there is going to be something which is called as logic of the element. So let's take example of WPF control. So I'll just mention here WPF control, and for example we will pick up here button control. So by default there is some appearance that we will have, and by default there will be some logic behind it. Now every time when we consider the look and feel of a button, it's always going to have a gray color. It is always going to have some sort of black text. It's always going to have some sort of click event. It's always going to have some sort of properties like name, maybe something called as content. It's going to have border and whatever. So you will find out certain properties are going to be anyway there with respect to button. So normally how the button logically should behave is going to be part of the logic itself, and how visually the button should appear, it is going to be part of this visual section that we have. So how exactly this property is typically set up? You will find out whenever button class is created, there is going to be something which is called as template or ultimately control template, which is mentioned with respect to that class. And that control template is going to have something which is called as a visual defined for the appearance of that control. So ultimately what I should mention here is visual is defined by using something called as template concept. And since some default templates exist with respect to every control in WPF, some are lookless controls, keep it in mind, some are with a visual. So for example, when we use stack panel was a container control. By default, we did not see stack panel anywhere, but then we realized it's a stack panel by simply putting controls inside it. So stack panel normally was a lookless control. It was a layout control, and when we placed controls inside it, then we realized it's part of stack panel as a container. But then can I really have an appearance for a stack panel? By default it is lookless. If you wish to have a stack panel some sort of appearance, you can see stack panel area by simply defining a background color. But it's a simple container control. When it comes to button by default has some sort of appearance. So every control in WPF, if we know this, every control in WPF comes from a base class called as control. Ultimately somewhere up in the hierarchy, we saw there is something called as dispatcher object or ultimately dependency object. And then we observe dependency properties are coming from dependency object. So similar way, like control is somewhere in the mid hierarchy, dependency object or ultimately dispatcher being, kind of you can say up in the hierarchy or level wise up in the hierarchy. So somewhere falls control down the hierarchy of dispatcher object or dependency object. You'll find out control class, when we see control class doesn't have something called as any appearance as such, and then button ultimately gets its appearance later on somewhere in the hierarchy. So you will find out what you can do is by default visual exists for a button, but what if I change this visual appearance of a button? What if I really want button should not appear like a block shaped button, rather it should appear more like an ellipse? So ultimately what we can do is we can convey that the button should appear more like ellipse by simply specifying a template property, ultimately control template property. So in WPF it is possible that whatever traditional look and feel that you have habit of seeing for a particular control, you can specify now the control should look more like ellipse instead of block shape button by simply specifying control template property. And how does it work in case of UI? So you will find out there is something which is called as content presenter. So if you recall, somewhere when we saw dependency property concept, when we try to understand the visual tree hierarchy of the controls alignment, you will find out there we saw something called as content presenter. So ultimately whenever button is going to get drawn on the screen, ultimately button will have a content presenter, and that content presenter is going to have something mentioned like the content presenter should represent the content, which is going to be something called as ellipse now. So ultimately instead of we having a default visual for a button, we will see a visual which is called as ellipse now. And ultimately, every other logic with respect to button will remain as it is. So now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to change the default appearance of a button to elliptical shape. Ultimately, it will show itself as an ellipse. It will not have those effects by default applied. When we see the ellipse or button as the ellipse, you will find out the ellipse will not have that concave shape. Button will not have that kind of, you can say, the click feel that you get, which means the button by default emits a behavior in terms of visual that it actually tries to show you as if you clicked on the button, which means you literally see it getting pressed down. So ultimately, such kind of a effect or such kind of a behavior by default ellipse will not emit, but then still we will see button will emit a click, and then wherever we used to see button, we will start seeing something called as ellipse then onwards. So how do we define control template for a button is what we will try to understand. Later on, what we will do is, instead of only targeting to something called as button, we will try to see, can we apply this control template property on something which is called as control itself directly. Which means, what if we define some sort of lookless control, and what if we provide some sort of appearance by ourselves to that control. So we will define the control, that means from the scratch. We will define the appearance for a control from the scratch. That is exactly what happens in case of custom controls. Custom controls typically are of couple of types, which means either you inherit your custom control class from existing so-called controls. For example, you inherit it from maybe button. So you can inherit it from existing classes like this, or you can straight away go and define here, that is, I want my control class to be inherited from simply control class. So when you say my control class is going to be inheriting from control, keep it in mind, control class doesn't have a look and feel. And then how do you provide a look and feel for your control? You only have one option then, that is going with something called as control template in that case. So we will try to see importance of control template in custom controls itself. But then as of now, I just want to have buttons appearance changed to ellipse in using control template concept. So let's see that in demonstration.